Though we covered Mr. Burroughs' novel Junkie on episode 29, additional information encourages us to revisit it, if only as a way to understand how he developed as a writer and how he came to write Naked Lunch. And when he recounted the history of his pre-1945 years in the preface to Junkie in 1953, he wrote that his self-characterization was marked by a lack of and a quest for motive, direction, and need. In his teens, he had drifted into solo adventures of juvenile risk-taking before making his way to Harvard, where he majored in English literature for lack of interest in any other subject. Now, after Harvard, he drifted around Europe for a year or so. Then, still unable to find a path that allured him, took graduate courses in psychology and jiu-jitsu, all while flirting on the edges of criminal behavior. Now, concerning his addiction, he said, "You become a narcotics addict because you do not have strong motivations in any other direction. I drifted along taking shots when I could score. I ended up hooked. You don't decide to be an addict." It is not until 1950 that Burroughs, on a copy of Jack Kerouac's debut novel, On the Road, writes that he's begun a novel of his own, titled Junk at the Time. Burroughs has big doubts about the salability of his book. Nevertheless, he keeps working on it. Now, after working on the manuscript for roughly a year, he makes the very reasonable remark, "I don't mean it as a justification or a deterrent or anything, but an accurate account of what I experienced during the time I was on junk. For one thing, the book was written in Mexico. It is difficult for anyone living in the States to realize how meaningless such a concept as justification is down here." Now, unconcerned with either defensive or aggressive impulses, he intended neither to justify nor to deter, but rather to document. In later revisions of drafts, he cut out all the theory and domestic relations in order to stick to a straight narrative, to get the message across as clearly as possible without the glam of artistry. Now, ultimately, he was quite pleased that publishers didn't want to edit or meddle with his writing in Junkie, a huge contrast to what would come several years down the line with Naked Lunch. Now, looking back in 1965, Burroughs recalled that when he began writing Junkie, quote, "There didn't seem to be any strong motivation. I didn't feel compelled. I had nothing else to do." Now, what divides Junkie from his second novel, Queer, and what steered the novel documenting his addiction to lead to a novel whose writing itself resembled an addiction could be attributed to the killing of his wife. That's right, his wife. Now, in the introduction to Queer on its publication in 1985, he confirmed that, quote, "The book is motivated and formed by an event which is never mentioned and, in fact, is carefully avoided, the accidental shooting death of my wife, Joan, in September 1951. And this shooting, accidental, was a turning point. And before the incident, an autobiography about Burroughs would read like a typical office document, in essence, a carefully detailed recount of real events. Whereas after the incident, his life reads more like a novel, albeit a novel few would wish to write, and none perhaps, except Burroughs, could live and survive. It is from this point on that we begin to see in his letters, as in his writing, a new interdependence between his persona and his writing. He arrived in Tangier at New Year 1954, which by then was an international zone and Freeport, technically not a part of Morocco at all. While the rest of the country was divided between France and Spain, Tangier was uniquely colonized by 8 jealous yet indifferent foreign powers. The result was a hybrid, neither African nor Western, but rather a city with many identities and therefore none. It was both a collage where anything goes and a place that was a kind of no man's land that attracted a similarly displaced personnel. Junkies, queers, drunks, about like Mexico, noting his experience of the place. Well, like all places where outlaw morality runs amok, there is also an abundance of temptations. After only 4 months in Tangier, he found himself heavily addicted to heroin once again. He did continue to write, however, writings that would later become Naked Lunch. Now, in 1954, April, after numerous attempts to get feedback from his friend Allen Ginsberg, Burroughs pleads to Jack Kerouac, writing, "The withdrawal symptoms are worse than the marker habit. One letter would fix me, so make it your business, if you are a real friend, to see that he writes me a fix. I am incapacitated, can't write, can't take interest in anything." You see, Burroughs feels a desperate need to receive a letter from Ginsberg in order to keep going. The letters he has been sending Ginsberg have gradually grown to constitute a unique epistolic eroticism, an economy in which love serves as a literal pretext. For example, in that letter he wrote to Kerouac, "Whenever I encounter the impasse of unrequited affection, my only recourse is in routines." Now, as dependent on Ginsberg, who was an ocean away as he was on Junk, Burroughs lets his routines become the harvest of a grim reaping of his own erotic and emotional failure. He stayed on in Tangier until September 1954, his addiction eating up his parents' $200 monthly check and leaving him on the edge of poverty and illness by the end of his 9-month-long journey. Now, I am just writing to put off the misery I will feel when I stop writing, he comments the following month. I know it's there, waiting for me. Following his stay in Tangier and upon reaching England, he began an apomorphine treatment in 1956. By then, he knew that the death and life of addiction had to end in writing. This time, I'll make it if it kills me.